Hello everybody. Today's gonna be a little bit different of a video. I've been sort of planning to do something like this at some point, but basically I wanted to sort of do a channel update video, but also talk about sort of the state of Siege, which I think a lot of you people are sort of curious. My takes on things, what I would improve, what I think Ubisoft could do different, and all that jazz. So I was thinking that's what we're gonna do today. I wanted to start talking about the channel on its own. Like I said, this update was basically gonna come sooner or later. I've been doing Siege for 7 years. I got the game, just a couple of days after it actually came out, and I've basically been playing the game non-stop since then. And especially with the state of Siege right now, I feel like now is a good time to consider doing more variety content. Don't get me wrong, if Siege was in a good state, I probably wouldn't really consider it, at least right now. But because the game is in the state that it is, I feel like in order to sort of future-proof my abilities to be able to make content for you guys, I feel like it's the best course of action to do more variety content. And I'm excited to do that because it's gonna allow me to have a lot more fun with the content that I'm making. I'm gonna be able to put out more content, first of all. If you're just making Siege content, especially right now, it's kind of hard to just have topics to talk about, because there's so little things happening. But more on that later. But of course, the views and the economics of it obviously play into the situation. But with that said, I want to clarify that, I'm not doing bad, economically speaking, but it has obviously been going downhill for the last 6 months, I would say. If you want to support me, obviously just sharing the content, watching the Twitch stream, that helps out more than you think. So I appreciate that. I really do. Basically, I was sort of considering quitting YouTube altogether. Well, it was one of the things that I was thinking of. And perhaps maybe just focusing on Twitch full-time or part-time or literally not at all. Because I feel like especially YouTube lately has just not really been supporting the type of content that I want to make. And especially when it comes to the way that they promote shorts, I'm just not about shorts. I don't like them at all. But YouTube is something that I'll be continuing, so don't worry about that. There are some changes that I'm doing in order to appease the algorithm gods, at least a little bit. But let's get into probably why most of you are actually here, which is the state of Siege. Siege is in a really bad spot right now. There's no other way of saying it. Some people are saying it's dying, some people are saying it's dead. I don't really consider them true necessarily, but it's definitely on its way there. Obviously, numbers are down basically everywhere, whether it's Steam, whether it's Xbox, whether it's PlayStation, I mean, you name it. And I'm kind of afraid that if nothing is done, Siege is potentially done. But in this part of the video, I'm gonna cover most issues that I have with the game itself. I'll explain a few things for you viewers that I think are misunderstood, but I'll also critique the developers and Ubisoft where I think it's applicable. And with that, I want to start by saying that when I say devs, I mean the actual developers. And when I say Ubisoft, I mean the company itself. Because they are two very different things, and I feel like when you critique one of them, you don't necessarily want to critique the other, right? It's not the developer's fault that Ubisoft as a company pushes for NFTs. That's the dumbass company doing that. But yeah, just be aware of that difference heading into this video. But let's start with the big one. The one that if they actually can address it in a good manner, I think Siege is probably fine, because I think the game itself is okay. Obviously can be improved, but it is okay. But cheating of all forms, whether it's wall hackers, aimbotters, smurfers, mouse and keyboard on console, yes, they are cheaters too. It feels like they're everywhere. If you play on PC, you get wall hackers and aimbotters in every single ranked game, at least in higher elos, plus and above. I even see some of them in unranked, I see some of them in quick match, you see them in TDM. On console, it's the same thing there with mouse and keyboard cheaters. It's bad. I understand that cheating isn't a one-off battle, it's a war of attrition, and it'll never completely go away. But I wouldn't be mad if I played a cheater every once in a blue moon. I play cheaters. Maybe not every single game, I don't know, because that's also the issue. There's so many cheaters right now that you get paranoid about every death. Every death becomes a potential cheater. I can't really say then what's already been said by a lot of people. I'm basically just adding my name to this list of people that are essentially echoing the same issue. Ubisoft has to allocate more resources to deal with cheaters faster. I get that manual bans might not necessarily be the most long-term effective way of dealing with cheaters, but it would sure as hell help right now. There are cheaters who run rampant for weeks. Bans for toxicity and cheating just needs to happen much more often and especially faster. Right now, the players need that satisfaction. They need to see you directly deal with cheaters. Speaking of anti-cheat measures, stat bans. You'd think that Ubisoft would learn from when they had automated toxicity bans and a lot of innocent people got caught in the midst, because it's the exact same thing here with the automated stat bans. I don't really know exactly what triggers them. Some people say that it has to do with the headshot percent, which is weird because in a game where the gunplay is, to a degree, heavily luck-based, you know, you get that one lucky recall headshot, of course the headshot percent can change drastically from day to day. So if that is what it is, then that's very weird, because it sure as hell doesn't have to do with KD, because there are cheaters out there that have almost 250 KD and they're not banned, which I feel like if there's any stat that stat bans should be hitting, it's that 10,000 elo trappers on console, right? Like, why isn't the stat ban hitting this? There's no way a legit player is hitting these numbers. This is just not happening. The thing I don't understand is what's the point in automation if the automation doesn't do what it's supposed to do in the first place? However, it's hitting legit players. Then let's talk about Siege's second biggest issue. The toxicity within the community is at an all-time high. I don't think it's ever been that bad, especially if you look at the charity bundle that came out with the release of Vector Glare, the Rainbow OSA bundle. I mean, team killings have spiked. I will say this, when I was writing this script, Ubisoft actually did put out a patch in Vector Glare, which essentially enables the team killing bans with the reputation system. Credit where credit is due. That is a great change. But also just in general, the language that people use has become much, much worse. More needs to be done about it, both from the dev side, but also just as a community. You need to speak up. If you see them harassing someone, tell them. Tell them to stop. The communication, especially recently, has gotten really poor, especially with all the delays. It's really good that you're letting us know that stuff gets delayed, but if you're not going to tell us why, people are going to get worried. First of all, you reduce the amount of content we're getting. We're not getting 2 operators per season. We're not getting a new map per season. And instead, these core system changes are what's supposed to essentially replace that. But when you keep also delaying said core system changes, not only does it feel that you've reduced the content we're getting, but we're also not even getting the content that you've essentially replaced that content with. And that causes a lot of frustration, especially if you can't explain why. And it looks really bad from our point of view, because it basically just looks like the Siege studios are understaffed, underexperienced, or similar. Another note on communication from the creator side of things. But when I say creators, I don't just necessarily mean YouTubers or streamers. I mean cosplayers, artists. Keep us in the loop and actually like value what we're here to do for your community. You working with us creators is mutually beneficial to both of us. We can promote things for you efficiently, but only if you actually start talking with us. And with that said, you're absolutely welcome to hold us to a higher standard as well. I think the Ubisoft Star Player should be a beacon of what that actually means. And right now, I think that the Ubisoft Star Player program is kind of a mess. It has the potential to be something that's really great for the community, but when you have a lot of deserving people that should be in there who aren't, and there are people in it who absolutely should not be in there. And with an example there, we can obviously talk about one Ubisoft UK representative who is a star player, except he's a known plagiarist, traced a bunch of people's art, claimed it as his own, and you still house this person to this day. That is embarrassing. And that is just an example of the low quality control that you guys actually have. Another issue with communication is that we have seasons and patches getting released with absolutely zero hype about them. There's more hype around the test server than the actual release of the season, which especially I think it's insulting to console players, because they don't have the test server. And I understand why they don't, but you should be hyping up the release as if it's a new game. Stop treating these seasons as small DLCs. They're big for us players, and you should be promoting them as such. You have seasons that are coming out, getting announced a day before they actually go live. It's extremely frustrating for us content creators to get surprise drop, because we want to plan out our weeks just like any other person. We want to know what weekdays we work on. And it's the same thing with the in-game events too. You do the same thing there. Sometimes I wake up and you don't even announce 24 hours in the beginning. You literally just drop it without any prior hype. I think that's also just really annoying for people who have normal jobs as well, who don't get that many hours a week to actually play video games. People want to plan their weeks. Start respecting your players' time. In fact, I won't even be surprised if the Year 7 Season 2 event, that's most likely going to be live within the next week or two, will have the exact same issue. I'm going to call that one. Another big issue I have is the way that creators and non-pro players end up feeling unappreciated by Ubisoft. This isn't just me. It's been a big issue for a lot of big creators in the past. It's always felt like they didn't care that we were promoting their game for free, and they just kind of expect us to do it anyways. This is a major reason why a lot of creators either stopped creating Siege content or even quit making content altogether. Tio, Serenity, Anthony Pitt, Marley, Tuxbird, Russian Badger. We're talking multi-million channels that Siege has lost due to Siege's inability to appreciate the work that these people put in. I remember one E3 that me and Tux went to, and yes, I'm gonna toot my own horn. The community devs who worked there, despite knowing who we were, treated us like complete nobodies. Instead of activating us for some cool events there, which me and Tux happily would have done for free, they had instead hired and paid their own friends to act as the face of the game at the E3 booth that Siege held. This wasn't the first time this had happened either. I've been to many events where this has happened, and the first round of in-game charms was used for this as well. This is a downward spiral. When players get demoralized and don't feel seen and listened to like this, they don't want to create content for your game. And with less creators, less views and search engine optimization overall, this has actually played a large part in the decline of players. It shouldn't really come as a surprise. With less YouTubers making content, there's less views on your game, which means less players, which means even less views for content creators. It's just a downward spiral, essentially. Also, this one really annoys me. And I mean, absolutely no offense to the creators here, but why is Siege putting Siege ads on Siege creators' channels? What does promoting Siege on a Siege channel do? Whereas if that money was actually spent on getting other big YouTubers that don't really play Siege to do it, would actually benefit everyone instead, as that would heavily boost the search engine optimization on YouTube and on Twitch as well. It's good to make sure that Siege creators obviously feel appreciated, but don't waste your marketing budget on something that could instead benefit the entire community, which is growth. I think a perfect example here is Epic. While I dislike Fortnite as a game and the EGS launcher, the way that they've communicated and worked with creators and artists over the last few years is phenomenal. Paid promotions, creator codes, extremely good ways of hyping up their content and much more. I think Epic, Apex Legends in particular, and Riot Games are a great example of how holding a mutually beneficial relationship with your creators and artists will just benefit you in the long run. When Siege does well, so does Ubisoft. It's their golden goose, and I'd be surprised if they just let it go, even though it feels like they are. Let's talk about design philosophy, because I see a lot of misunderstandings on what kind of game that Siege is supposed to be. Obviously it is an FPS, and gunplay is part of that. But the major parts that make Siege Siege are related to physics and destruction, and of course the primary gadgets. And I think it's vital to understand that these are the actual pillars that build the foundation of the game. When you're looking at the game design, guns are simply a tool that is essentially meant to finish the job. And with that said, MP5 ACOG spawn peeking isn't Siege. Gadgets and destruction are what sells Siege. It's the spectacle that differentiates Siege from other first-person shooter. That's why players feel like gadgets take up a lot of the gameplay, because they're supposed to. The best way to enjoy Siege is to realize the audience that it's meant for. If you don't match that audience, the game simply isn't for you, and you're doing yourself a disservice by playing it. If you want to play a highly realistic milsim, you'd be much happier playing Arma, playing Tarkov, playing Ready or Not, which are all great games that I play on the side of Siege when I want something different, because that's not what Siege caters to. Obviously, it used to sort of do in the past, but I understand that that's not the game that Siege is trying to be, so that's not the reason I play Siege. If you want to play a high-paced FPS instead, with focus on gunplay, you have Call of Duty or Battlefield. If you want to play a slow-paced, tactical hero shooter that combines destruction and physics into the game, then Siege is for you. And let these games be what they are designed to be. Not every single game on the market will be designed to fit the way that you like to play games. And when you actually learn to see that, you'll be much happier.
Personally, my biggest issue with Siege and my biggest concern is that it's not casual enough. It's a game that is sweaty and will forever be sweaty. There's nothing lighthearted about that fucking game, and it's frustrating.
Another huge issue with Siege as a game as a whole is that there simply isn't a single way to enjoy playing Siege casually. In order to truly enjoy Siege and its high lethality, you always have to sweat to keep up, even in quick match, right? Quick match is not casual because Siege's game design isn't casual in nature at all. There's simply no way of enjoying Siege in a more relaxed nature. Siege feels the best when it's played slow and tactical. Spawn peeking and aggressive play promotes bad gameplay. I used to have the opinion that spawn peeks, at least to a degree, promotes a sense of danger and that attackers have to be somewhat careful. And while I do think that that is, you know, good, with the overall lethality of the game, a spawn peek will almost always result in half the lobby disliking the game. Either the attacking team for losing a guy, or the defending team for the same reason. At the end of the day, playing the entire round with a disadvantage, or not playing at all, isn't fun. Siege already has issues with downtime. On the same note, I kind of want to point at how Drone After Death, which I know Ubisoft are still iterating on, is a good help in order to allow people to still enjoy the game despite being dead. If they had actually made a few adjustments to Echo and Maestro, as well as drones actually dropping on your body instead of spawn, would have actually made it shippable. The design of Drone After Death wasn't necessarily flawed, but I think that the balancing was. That's the case with a lot of issues in Siege. It's not necessarily that the ideas are bad, except for Blackbeard, but that the balancing of the idea is. And I think in order for you to understand these issues with spawn peeking and such, you have to realize that in a game of 10 people, your experience is not the only one that matters. It's important that everyone, including the guys that you actually shoot at, have fun. And here's a hot take: staying alive is fun. Another great video that sort of covers the issues with Siege's high lethality is Gregor's video that specifically covers the one-shot headshot. I'm gonna link to it in the description, probably on the card thing. It's gonna pop up right here. And I highly recommend that you go and watch this after you watch my video. Now, with all this said, I actually think that the Siege devs have actually made good changes. And despite complaints from Valk mains, I think that the outside cam nerf improved these issues a lot. But we could do more. I think one cool suggestion that I learned while playing a similar game to Siege called Due Process is that they directly worked against spawn peekers. If you stood in a doorway or a window that led outside, you'd be marked and shot by a UAV. if you stood there too long. And I think that while I wouldn't necessarily do exactly like that, I think that Siege could do something similar with pinging defenders that are standing near broken or open windows. I think this promotes better gameplay with having people actually be able to get inside the building where the actual game is played. In the same vein of spawn peeking, hyper-aggressive play focused solely around mechanical skills is bad for the game as well. Having these players that QE spam around corners in order to net kills instead of actually tactically outplaying the enemy sets a bad precedent for how you actually improve at Siege. I think playstyles like these come and go in Siege because Ubisoft intentionally tries to push them away, but it's time that they just rip off the band-aid and get rid of them completely. One, I think a fatigue or inertia system could do wonders if you actually applied it to leaning, having the leaning animation slow down if leaning too fast in succession. And two, increase the amount of rounds a ranked game has. You might ask, how does increasing the amount of rounds combat aggressive play? Well, with the short amount of rounds in a ranked game, the window for adapting to rat playstyles is too small. If they manage to rat themselves a round or two, even if you manage to snag in a third round before the side swap, you're already at a round disadvantage. More rounds benefits the smarter players who can adapt to certain playstyles as they gain intel on the way people play. And it also punishes people who rely on cheese playstyles to win. I think if Siege has something like 4 to 5 ranked rounds before switching sides, I think that would be a great change. On another note, over the years, Siege has removed a lot of the data you can see on enemies and teammates, and while I agree that this data is usually used for toxicity, we all know how easy it is to circumvent. Hell, Ubisoft even provides the API for the add-ons that circumvent this. Many people utilize various allowed add-ons to gather intel on the enemy before the game has even started. And I think it's time that the game just provides this itself in order to equal the playing field. If I'm able to gather experience on the enemy before the game, I can better adapt my experience to make sure that my team and I enjoy the match going into it. And same thing for the enemy team as well. They will see that I play a lot of Clash and they can ban it. We even saw this as an example way back in the E3 trailer where they adapted to the enemy's booby trap playstyle going into the match, which is a really cool thing to be able to bring into a game. And the part of prepping with prior info is core within competitive Siege. And if we could actually have this in the normal ranked sphere of things, that would be a good addition. Things like showing the enemy's most played operators somewhere could go miles in improving the game, as people's favorite ops say a lot about their playstyles and mind for the game. I'm looking at you, Ash Jägermains. And here we go. One of the few things that I think a lot of people of you are excited to talk about. First of all, Siege's balancing philosophy is flawed. But I also think that the community's reactions to balancing decisions are usually made with emotional reactions with a sprinkle of keyboard warrior. First of all, the issue probably everyone has. Things take way too long to change. Usually, metas that become problematic take around 9 months to deal with, when in reality, it should take 9 weeks. Lion meta, utility dump meta, and now the LMG, Finka, Yana meta all took well over 9 months to deal with. There's a fairly popular saying that I've heard passed around on game design forums, which is, given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of your game. And it's very, very, very true for live service multiplayer games. And when you give players 9 months to optimize the game before you decide to act on it, you have a problem. You have the test server. And last year, you announced the lab server, which was going to host a lot more experimental changes. After announcing it, you haven't utilized it a single time except for attacker repick. Try some crazier balancing changes there. Do some exciting stuff. It gives us content creators more to talk about, and it's more exciting when the game changes. Despite all the criticism, I don't actually think Siege makes bad balancing decisions. They're just way too slow at doing it. I play a lot of other games, and seeing their philosophy around balancing and content makes so much more sense than Siege's. And regular balancing is exciting for the players. And again, allows content creators like me to actively create more content. If I have more stuff to talk about, I can make more videos. Seeing Siege drop balancing notes of 3 is just disheartening. I remember this was around the SI patch, and the argument was made that changes weren't made to not screw up pro players' competitive integrity moving into SI. I personally don't find it worth it that the 99% of community has a less exciting game to play and watch because Ubisoft claims that pros can't keep up. If they can't keep up with the meta, they don't deserve to be pros. I think one of the best comparisons here is League of Legends. Now, I know, most of you guys aren't interested in the game itself, but the way they do balancing and the way their devs communicate the changes is super exciting to me. And I wish that Siege's devs took notes, because I think Riot's philosophy here is a lot better. Not perfect, but better. They'll have a good 3 to 4 patches within a Siege season's lifespan, each patch being bigger than a Siege season itself. And before what is essentially their form of SI, there's usually a very big patch called the Worlds patch, which usually aims to spice up underperforming characters moving into their world championship. This creates excitement for everyone, as we get to see crazy picks and team comps form over the next month and tossed right into S-tier play, and the new strats that we could see pro players work with. This season, we're not even getting a balancing patch, which is extremely sad with the current state of the meta, with LMGs taking up all the space and Finka being the one spearheading them, when simple changes like removing her gun 6 or removing her frag grenades could overnight tone her down a bit. It's a simple change, and I'm extremely surprised that the devs choose to do nothing about it. And the same thing applies to Yana. Now, let's flip this a bit on its head. There are balancing issues regarding the way that the community reads into changes as well. Very often, people look at the changes they think are unnecessary and throw a fit over them. Now, I'm not exactly gonna go over each and every change, but I'll go over a fairly popular example, which was also fairly recent: Sledge losing his SMG-11. On surface level, this didn't make too much sense, but once you deep dive into the change, I found that it was actually fairly healthy for the game, and the way that a lot of players approach playing Sledge before the change, many Sledges I saw would just kind of rush using the hammer and SMG, whereas with the removal of the SMG, I've seen more Sledges play vertical in my entire Siege career. The change encouraged Sledge players to actually play Siege. And that's the thing with balancing and design. Sometimes you may need to do certain changes in order to get people to play the game the way that it's intended in design. Sometimes you nerf for balance, sometimes you nerf for design. I think in order for Siege to kind of get back to where it used to be, where the game was slower and more methodical, changes like these are very healthy for the game in the long run. Characters like Old Ash and now current Finka are bad for the game's health. And despite people's hate for trap operators, I think they are very important for the intended design of the game. They slow the game down and they punish players who are reckless, which is a good thing. Trap operators are only as powerful as the victim is smart. And yes, it is my fault when I step in a frost mat, not Frost. Before we're going to the next chapter, I also want to mention balancing in regards to fixing the overcomplexity of Siege operators. Removing hidden features, such as withstand, is healthy for the game in the long run. The game is complex enough as it is, in terms of lore, gadgets, and abilities. Should be straightforward in order to ease new or returning players into Siege's vast learning curve. Here comes probably some of the more hotter takes. Siege pros need to realize that they are entertainers, and are especially not a good sample of the average player of Siege. Far from it. Just like us, to a degree, they are content creators. They are much more dependent on the game being enjoyed by the viewers than themselves. This whole balance only for the pros and it's balance for everybody mentality just needs to die, because it's extremely harmful for the community and creates a rift between casuals who you want to watch and follow Pro League and pros. Realize that you're not a good representative of the broader community. Listen to the community instead of alienating them, or even worse, sending harassment their way. and use that info that you gather in order to make informed suggestions to the devs. This is the reason why you do not feel listened to at pro player workshops. Your suggestions are selfish and ignore the majority of the community, which the devs obviously can't. If you want the community to better understand the game and agree with you as a pro player, work on that. Create content and teach them how to understand the deeper levels of Siege competitive play. Creating a big rift within the community will only shoot yourself in the foot. You can't sell a product while saying that 80% of your consumers don't matter. Having this elitist mindset only scares away old, returning, or new players. Balancing for one part of the community doesn't mean that it's inherently balanced for the rest, because the rest of the community simply do not play the game in the same way the top level does. And they never will. That's why they're in lower elos. Yet, their enjoyment of the game is still important, and ignoring them isn't an option. As for the actual way to view Siege as a spectator, unless you're heavily invested into competitive Siege, it is extremely hard to follow. And the obsession with forcing observers to utilize player POV is also just bad. Lots of action is missed, and it becomes increasingly harder as a viewer to understand what's happening. I understand that this is kind of a hot take because Siege is an FPS. Why would you not use the player POV when spectating the game? But the truth is that Siege is just so lethal and crazy things happen so fast that it's incredibly hard to keep up with when all you see is one player's POV out of 10. So yes, I think that Siege Pro Play should start using the top-down view a lot more than what they actually are. It's easier to follow defenders in prep phase during a setup and actually see the sight lines they establish and such. But also the same for attackers setting up and execute. Being able to see all the action that commences at once would be a great thing and allow regular players to get a deeper understanding of why pros play the positions they do and what that achieves. Also, for fuck's sake, stop with the hostilities the moment someone who isn't a pro talks about their opinion of the game. They talk from their experience, which is just as valid as yours. Another somewhat hot topic in recent years have been maps. And now map bans. I think the much more open ranked pool is beneficial to the community, as it allows more content and it makes the game require more effort to stay good at. We all know that in the current state of Siege, ranks just do not represent actual skill very well. We've seen diamond players make astronomically poor setups. The sad part is that, especially in recent years, it's become increasingly easy for bad players to get higher ranks, both through boosting services made by cheaters, but also because the game has required a lot less of you to actually stay good. Last year during Crimson Heist and North Star, most ranked games ended up on Clubhouse and Oregon. And it was not only really boring, it also made it so that you only had to get good at these maps. Which absolutely, repetition is a skill on its own, but I think flexibility is a better showcase of what actually makes a Siege player good. Nowadays, when I can bring people to bad maps, like Favela, Emerald Plains and such, I, who's actually spent time learning these maps, can punish players who only learn by getting good on maps they like. It allows people who are better at the game in general to win more games, because on bad maps, the better team will likely have a much higher chance of winning, since better players can exploit why the map is bad. We see the very same thing in pro play, with teams who might have a really strong small map pool fall off really hard the moment they start moving into best of 3s and best of 5s. I know that I may not have covered every single individual issue with Siege's design, but I think I've covered a lot of the logic that you can apply to said issues. All in all, with all that I've said in this video, and especially during the beginning, I hope Siege has a renaissance, because Siege really is a really great game when it works. And I want to keep making Siege content for the foreseeable future. If I missed anything, either let me know in the comment or head over to the Twitch stream and ask me about it there. I'll most likely be live when this video is live. If you stayed until the very end, thanks so much for watching. Like the video, subscribe, yada yada yada, and send the video around to your buddies, and let's hashtag save Siege. Bye bye.